So the people who are joining us on YouTube just now, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. And we're going to go ahead and get started here. So first thing that I wanted to just bring up is just my gratefulness for the fact that people are starting to really take an interest and support the ministry from afar and tune in and be a blessing in our lives and in the lives of everyone else just by being present. We do have this set up in such a way that we can we're going to DVR the service on YouTube, and so people can watch it later, but coming and actually participating and being live, and for those who are actually showing up locally as well. Because I could tell you there's a kind of a thing that I've always had, and of course here's some rabbi's honesty. The short version is that preaching to a camera with no one present is like really not my thing, right? I need to believe that there's people behind the camera that are hearing or seeing. And so that's just a psychological thing, but it's big, right? It affects me. At any rate, so thank you for showing up and thank you for your participation. You know, this parasha that we are in, and I'll just remind you guys that about a year ago, almost to the day, we shifted from messages that didn't have the parasha in them to messages that do have the parasha in them. And ever since then, it's been strange because I still receive a message that's pertinent to today, but it always seems to correspond with the parasha. At any rate, we're going to go ahead and get into this week's parasha. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, we're going to jump into Numbers 25:10 is where the parasha starts, but we're actually going to jump into it in the first verse. It says, while Yisrael remained at Shittim, the people began to commit infidelity with the daughters of Moab. For they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Take note of the fact that they're eating here. Part of a sacrifice was eating the sacrifice. It was the Greeks who would leave food by a statue and it would rot. But the Canaanites and the Israelites all ate their sacrifices as if to say they were equal with the God who they were sacrificing with. So Israel became followers of Baal Peor, and the Lord was angry with Israel. I would like to take a look at this word Peor real quick. Okay. So right here is our word Peor. And we'll go ahead and just jump right into the definition here. Baal Peor. Notice that's all kind of one word, but it's coming from the root Peor, right? Which means cleft. Now, if you go into this, it means to open wide or gape, okay? And we're going to go ahead and jump into the ancient pictographic Hebrew here and take a look at this definition in the ancient pictographs. Open wide, as in a gate. Sound familiar? To open wide, a cracking open, a crack. An instrument used to call attention or to warn. I'm sorry, that's, Peor, here we go. Right? Now, the concept here is that it is a cracking open. I'm sorry. So there is a connection between the cracking open here with a Pei Sadi Mem, and then above it we've got Pei Ayin Mim Nun. Okay, and so this is what we call an adopted root. Real quick, let's jump over to the whiteboard and take a look at something when we're talking about adopted roots versus non-adopted roots. So short version of this is, if we were to go with the Hebrew name for God, we've got, actually, you know what, let's do it this way. I'm going to go, let's do yellow, and let's do blue, and let's do magenta for our colors. Okay, so Hebrew name of God is Yod, Hey, Vav. Okay, and the principle is that basically we have Yod, we have Hey, and we have Vav. And then we know that the other representation of Yahweh is going to be the functional representation of him, which is, and I'm sorry for my atrocious Hebrew. Okay, this Ale, and that is represented by an olive. And then of course we have the possibility of a doubled last letter. So we'll just go ahead and put in, we'll just put a X to represent the doubled last letter. If a word contains these letters minus the lamed, anything that's circled here, let's say, okay? So let's take a look at our word. Okay. And this is going to be pay. See, we'll get back to this Hebrew really quick. Let's take a look at that real quick. Pei ayin chesh. Pei ayin chesh. Okay. And it's cleft. A mountain peak in Moab belonging to Abiram, to the Abiram range near Pisgah. Proper noun in reference to a deity. Okay. Peor is used 5 times in scripture. It's used for Balak. He takes Balaam to the top of Peor, right? And then they have the part for, they have been hostile with you with their tricks in the matter of Peor. That's in this week's parasha. Then in next week's parasha, behold, they caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to be unfaithful to Yahweh in the matter of Peor, right? And then in Joshua 22, is the wrongdoing of Peor not enough for us, for which ye have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although the plague came on the congregation of Yahweh. We're going to get into that a little bit, but for now, what I'm wanting to do is just show you that we have for our root, Pei ayin chesh. Okay, now getting back over here, we have Pei ayin resh. Ayin resh. Okay. So obviously there is no there's no yod. I'm sorry, there is no olive. There's no yod, there's no hay, and there is no vav. And there's no double last letter, which means that this is an adopted root. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this adopted root that's intriguing. And it is basically that this adopted root is actually foreign. And our proof is actually in the fact that the word or the name itself is peor. That right there, here, let's do it this way. This right here is basically vowel points put under this to pronounce it a certain way, but there's no Hebrew grammar in this word, peor. Okay, so although, and this is the part that's interesting, is although this is a foreign word that's transliterated, okay? And let me explain to you what that means, transliteration, really quick. When you have a language that does not contain a pronounceable way to identify a sound, you transliterate it. For example, the name Yeshua in Greek, in Hebrew, in Cyrillic, in Arabic, in Aramaic, in Amharic, in Ethiopic, which Amharic is Ethiopic, and in Ugaric, there is an SH sound. Okay, there isn't really one in Assyrian. There's kind of an SH sound in Assyrian. Arabic has two versions of it, right? And so the reason why this is important is because when we get into Greek, it does not have an SH sound. So then we go that it's going to be Yeshua becomes Yesua, right? Yesua. Now we add in the fact that there's no Y in the Greek language. There's a capital Y that represents a U, which makes it sound, okay? But there's not a place where it makes a y sound or a J sound, yeah, right? Yeah. So the reason why this is important is because now we have a way to pronounce it in the Greek. We have I-E, Yeshua, right? Yeshua. Well, about 500 years ago, we had the first I in every word that was in Latin was converted to a J and made a J sound. Okay, so we went from Yesu, Yesua, right, to Jesua. Okay, well, in Greek, there is actually a sounding that you were supposed to put at the end of words in order for there to be a identification that it is the subject of the verb. And that is that you put an S at the end. So now we have Jesus, which of course we pronounce Jesus, right? Which is just a transliteration of the Hebrew word Yeshua, right? Yeshua to Jesus through Greek, right? Through Greek that didn't have those letters present. Well, the same is present in a situation where we have the Canaanite languages, Phoenician, we have Southern Canaanite, we have, I think it's Southern Phoenician. I would have to look on my chart. The point is that basically peor is not a word in the Hebrew language. However, it's transliterated with the soundings. okay? That's going to become important here in a minute, because even though that the Strong's Concordance actually lists it as the root being pa'ar, that is not necessarily the case, but there's a play on words that occurs here, and I'm going to show you that. So the best way I can explain this to you is that the word peor is actually not Hebrew, okay? It is Moabite, and therefore probably southern Canaanite. But the point is that pa'ar is a Hebrew word. And so there's a play on words that occurs here. And if you don't have an understanding of Torah or understanding of Hebrew, you wouldn't get this. Okay. There's two reasons why this is important. Number one is because they used letters to describe something that doesn't necessarily jive with the concept. What I mean by that is that Baal is a false god of the Canaanites, and Baal of Peor was a false god of the Moabites. But Peor does not mean that there was a split in the mountain. That's just the letters they use to spell the word. There's a reason why this is important, and I'm going to get to it right now. So basically, we're going to jump back over to our board here. Okay, so first of all, I think something that's really important here is the concept that this means to split open. Because the truth is that if we were to, when we need to hunt down an adopted root because it doesn't have these letters. So like, say, for example, if I was to use, let me do it this way. So we're going to go with, let's see, what's a good yod. Okay, that's good. Yep. Yep, that's actually a great one, since we've been talking about it anyway. So here's the root word of Yeshua. This is yasha. Yasha. Okay. And so now if we needed to find out the parent root, well, going back to our original model here, let's get rid of the X's and circles, and we don't need the lamed in there. What we're going to find is that this does indeed contain one of those letters. Which one? Well, of course, it is going to be the yod, right? So what does that mean? That means that we can drop the yod out, and we know that our parent root is this one right here. And of course, if you recall, it means destroyer. Watches. Right? Destroyer watches. And so leaving the yod out, we know that the root here of the name Yeshua, which means salvation, starts with the idea of the destroyer watches. Who's the destroyer? The shepherd who is guarding their sheep and waiting for the predator, because they're going to destroy the predator. Okay, but notice with this child root, that what we have going on is the ability to drop this yod. Now, the reason why this is important is because then we have this two-letter parent root, which is a combination of what? The two front teeth, right? And the eyeball. And the two front teeth crush or destroy. Crush. And, of course, the eyeball watches. So it's easy to go find the root there. And so we found it, and now we know if we add the yod back in, then we've got what? We've got to snatch out of danger violently. In other words, the destroyer does the action, and the yod makes that the action. Okay. All right. But here we have a adopted root, and we don't have the reason why there would be an opening. Now, I propose to you that Pe Ayin can potentially be one. So let's talk about this. We're always going to come back to a 2-letter parent root, right? 2-letter parent root. So it could be this, right? It could be Pe Ayin. Okay. It could be Pe Resh. Right? It could be Ahin Resh. Right? Been doing my Ayin bad. We're going to clean it up a bit. Ahin Resh. Okay. So those are our possible parent roots. Okay. So that's actually what we need to go research. The reason why is because what we want to know is why does this mean to be open, and why does peor mean cleft? Right? Why does peor mean cleft? And you'll notice one of the reasons why I say that peor is a foreign word. Let's just talk about that for just a brief second. But one of the reasons I say that peor is a foreign word is because it's only used in the mention of peor. There's no other usage of it, and it doesn't mean cleft. Okay, there are other words for cleft in Hebrew. Okay. Now, pa'ar, on the other hand, let's just take a look at this really quick. Pa'ar, on the other hand, is used a number of times. Job 16:10, they have gaped at me with their mouths. Intriguing, very intriguing. That word gaped does not mean in the sense of like they're opening something in order to allow something in, but instead that something is coming out. Okay, they waited for me as for the rain and opened their mouths as for the late rain. Okay, and then I opened the mouth wide and panted and longed for your commandments. Psalm 119, 131. And then Isaiah 5:14. Therefore, Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth beyond measure. And Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her noise of revelry, and her jubilant within her descend into it. Okay, so you notice that pa'ar is not used in the sense of any false god per se, but is instead an idiom. Okay, it's used as an idiom in every usage of it. So it behooves us to find out about this word, right? Okay, so in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a different book than what I usually use. I usually use the Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible. Today, we're actually going to use this book, the Ancient Hebrew Language and Alphabet book. 2 reasons is because basically what we have is 2-letter combination definitions all the way throughout it. There is no actual lexical roots. Let's talk about a lexical root real quick, just to kind of refresh everybody's memory. I'm sure people remember it, but just in case. So in general, let's say that, let's just really quick over here. So let's say that I have something like, for example, heat, galach, heat galach. Okay, so heat galach is actually what we call the hifil, which is, I'm sorry, the hithpael conjugation, which means basically it's a reflexive. In other words, it's something that you do to yourself or something that you do to each other. If it's plural, in this case, it's not plural. So in this case, hitgalach is not something we could go back and figure out what it means. We have to work through the grammar first. So right off the bat, and the reason this is important, you'll see why this is important. So right off the bat, we can get rid of heat, right? Get rid of heat, and that means do it to yourself or to himself or herself, okay? Or themselves, if it's plural, in this case, it's not. So we can drop that, and then all that we're left with is galach. Galach. Now, the reason why I chose this one is because it's a very significant word, but basically hitgalach looks like this. Now, there may have been a yod or a vav in there somewhere, but for all intents and purposes, this is how it looks. And so this word right here means to apply a razor. Okay. And so this is, and by the way, this is in the third person masculine singular. And so this is, he shall shave himself. And this is actually in Leviticus chapter 13, and I think it is specifically in verse 33. Let's go take a look at it really quick, and I'll explain to you why it is significant. Going back into our tablet real quick here. Then he shall shave himself, but he shall not shave the scale, and the priest shall isolate the person with the scale 7 more days. And here is our Hebrew word, hitgalach, okay? Hitgalach. And you'll see, just as I said, it is in the third person singular, but it is the hithpael grammar, okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because this Gimel right here. Actually, you know what? Let's do it this way. This Gimel right here is the exact center of Torah. Okay, so, but you see how the grammar that I'm working with here is basically we're going to lose this in order to get to this. This is called the lexical root. Now, most people think that Hebrew grammar and word studies and all that are not important, but in this case, there is something hidden, okay? Okay, so in principle, as we look at that concept, apply a razor versus he shall shave himself, and that's how we're getting to the lexical root. So we're coming back over here, and we realize that this is the lexical root. That means every lexicon, the Brown Driver Briggs, the Gesenius, the Brenton, I think it's the Brenton, and obviously the Strong's Concordance, and many other more modern lexicons all contain lexical roots. However, that is not the true root of a Hebrew word. And you will see in a Strong's Concordance, for example, let me show you. Going back to our verse in Numbers, we are looking at Peor, jumping into our root. Boom, right there. A primitive root. Why? Because the principle is that after that, it goes back into the 2-letter roots. Now, like I said, listen, there's lots of ways to study scripture. But one of the reasons why sometimes you want to go ahead and go study out a word is because of the significance of the word, okay? So from that point of view, then we're going to go and we're going to take a look at this. Let's see. So how we're going to do this is we're going to, let's see. First, let's take a look at this. So what we're going to do first, we're going to go look up. We're going to go look up pe'ayin. Pe'ayin is our first word in the lexicon, or in the ancient Hebrew language and alphabet book. Okay, so we're going to need to go over to Pe, which there's really no easy way to search for it because they're all actually in the ancient. So we just got to kind of get to it, which can be a little bit annoying, but that's all right. We'll get through it. Okay, so Ayin is too far. Samek is about where we need to be. So we'll just go ahead and page over from here. Actually, we need to be past Samek, my bad. There we go, I was going the wrong direction. Okay, here we go. So the Pe starts here, okay? But we're going to go to Pe'ayin, which should be about right here. Okay, here we go. And what do we have? It's a viper, okay? A viper. So for our first word, and notice there's no explanation about it, but for our first word, we have viper, okay? Viper. Okay, now let's go a little bit. Let's see, we're going to go to, and by the way, I wrote viper up here on the screen. So now we're going to go to number 2, which is peresh. Okay. And for peresh, we've got open the head or tread. Okay. The heads of grains are scattered on the threshing floor, a smooth, hard, and level surface. An ox is led around the floor, crushing the heads, opening them to reveal the fruit inside. The wine press is a vat where the grapes are placed and tread on the open grapes to reveal the juices inside. At the conclusion of treading, an abundance of fruit is acquired. Okay, so this one is going to be tread. Switch back over here. Tread. Okay. And then the last one we're going to look up is the ayin resh. Ayin resh. Go back this way for that. And we have ayin resh. Naked. When the enemy is captured, he is stripped of his clothes to the skin. Okay, that's naked. Ayin resh. Okay, so remember this pe'ayin resh means to open wide. Let's go back really quick to our Strong's Concordance and see what we've got here. Open wide or gape. Which one of those seem to have the definition of opening attached to it? Well, obviously, one of the things that we are paying attention to or seeing here is the principle of what? We have the principle, let's see, let's go with green. We have the principle here in this definition of the fruit being opened, the grapes being opened by the feet, and the ox treading out the grain and exposing the fruit. Well, obviously, one of the things we have to remember is that this is actually the root word for fruit. Peri is the word fruit. For example, if I say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafin. Hagafin is grapes or the vine. Peri is fruit, and borei is who has brought. Right? Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who brings forth the fruit of the vine. This is the blessing, the ancient blessing over wine. And of course, our first usage of the word fruit is going to be in Genesis. So what's interesting about this is the Hebrew word Baal, and we're going to get to that. But one of the things that I want to bring forth in this is the concept of how fruit works. Now, having said all that, I think there's two things that are very important here. The first one is that viper opens its mouth and gapes. Viper opens its mouth and gapes. Okay? The stripping off of clothes or the tearing open of clothes has its connotation in this word. And so even though that the root is fruit, I want you to see this right here. This ayin, right? Because if we're going to do this in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we've got the picture of a mouth. In fact, I'm actually going to illustrate this a little bit more. Okay, we've got the picture of the mouth, and I'll just circle that so we know this is the symbol. It's like he's got a beard. Okay, and then this is the drawing of an eyeball, right? Okay, and then this is the drawing of a human head. Okay, and this has the representation all the time of open, or has the representation of rim, or not rim, but lip, or like the edge of something. Okay, and then this always has a representation of witness. Or observe. And then this always represents man. So really, literally, this is man opens, right? Which is that concept of exposing the fruit. And this is bearing witness. Okay. So technically what we have is man opens the fruit and bears witness, or exposes the fruit. There's our nakedness, right? Or swallows the fruit. There's our viper. But let's go ahead and let's take a look at the word Baal. Okay. Let's take a look at the word Baal, because we're going to identify this concept of fruit. So let's go ahead and move over to a new page. And I'm just going to write the word Baal up here. Okay, there's the word Baal. Now, what do we notice right off the bat? Well, this is not a child root. This is an adopted root. has no doubled last letter, contains no yod, no vav, and no hey, and no aleph. Okay, so we need to do the same thing we did before. We need to hunt this bad boy down. Recall that the principle is that this could be a root right here, or this could be a root right here, or this could be a root right here. We'll go ahead and we'll write our roots up here again. Okay. And how we investigate. Did that backwards, didn't I? How we investigate this is we're going to go bet ahin. Then we're going to go bet chamed. And then we're going to go ahin chamed. Okay. And of course, recall that we're going to put our definitions up here, and we're going to do this thing again. But before we do, we're going to go into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible and paste our Strong's Concordance in there, because basically what we have going on is the possibility that there is already a parent root that's been traced. Sometimes the case, sometimes not the case. So we have Baal meaning Lord, but that's actually a very inaccurate understanding of this word. If we go into the Gesenius, let's do that. If we go into the Gesenius, you will notice that it the Gesenius actually is not doing us any justice here. Hold on, let me let's switch this back to the English. Okay. And we will go to this word Baal in verse 3. And what we're looking for is this right here. Okay. Now, you'll notice they kind of don't get separated, Baal, Peor. They get stuck together for a reason. And there's a reason that is because there is a regular Baal and then there's a Baal of Peor. Now, getting into our Brown Driver Briggs, there is a discussion about this. And basically, what we see is the divine name is not used anywhere in the Hexateuch. It is probably originated in the sense of divine ownership rather than sovereignty. Okay, divine ownership rather than sovereignty. It seems to have been used in northern Israel for equating to Adon. Used in northern Israel for Lord, but then in southern Israel, the word Adon is used for Lord. Okay, that's going to be important. But then we're going to run into some really interesting stuff here, because we have the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Babylonians, all calling it Baal, right? In later times substituted for Beshet, right? Or sometimes scribes substituted Beshet for the name Baal because they didn't want to equate Baal to that. But then as we get deeper into this, we'll notice that it is actually the proper name of a location, but then also there's an indication here that it is going to have to do with the Lord himself, Yahweh himself, as being Baal Barit, the Lord of the covenant, as opposed to El Barit, right? So what we have is we have a word that generally means husband, okay? Husband, owner, or Lord, but the truth is that for all intents and purposes, it's husband. So we're going to get that Strong's Concordance number, and we're going to bring it over to our ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. Ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. And we are going to see if maybe a root is already presented to us. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about the word Baal here. as a yoke, which binds the master to the servant. We're going to get to that. Baal means to marry, as in to join to a husband or wife, right? Baal is master, is having chief authority, a workman qualified to teach apprentices. Okay, so could be the sense of journeyman, right? And then we have mistress if it's female. Then we have what is called a cognate. A cognate is when something sounds the same. And the B in speech is actually what's called a labial, because you use your lips, b, 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 and you use your lips for the m, 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 m. And so it's possible for there to be a cognate transition here. But here's an interesting thing about this. To transgress intentional, treacherous act that results in error. And we have ma'al, transgression. Then we have na'al, of being put on, or putting on something, or having your sandals on your feet. And then there are words sandal. So what do we have in common here? Ayin lamed, which means what? We have a parent root. And since we have a parent root, we don't have to go through that search that we did with the other one. And here is our parent root. It literally means yoke. Let's talk a minute about how. The ancient pictograph, ayin, is a picture of the eye, representing knowledge and experience, and the lamed is a picture of a shepherd's staff or yoke. Combine these mean experience the staff. The yoke, a staff, is lifted over the shoulder and is attached to the oxen for performing work. Okay, literally means above, as in the yoke above the head, right? But our theme here is going to be a continual discussion about the yoke. For example, captivity is where a yoke is placed on a captive. And that's the word galut, where we get the name Goliath, right? Galut. And by the way, this word galut was actually found on a stone, I believe in Louisiana, in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, literally meaning captivity. And then we've got ma'al, which means upward, in the direction from lower to higher. And so we're talking about elevation. Why? Because the yoke is above the head, right? Okay, and then on animals anyways. Okay, then we've got Ali, which is pedestal, as in lifted up and down to smash a mortar, right? We've got a trench or a water course that rises in elevation to bring down water from a higher source. Then we've got Alion, which means upper. And this is where we get the name El Elyon, right? Or which is the most high. El Elyon is the most high. Then we've got Alom, which is a young male at the prime age for work, or somebody who has grown up, right? Then we've got Alal. The yoke was listed up onto the shoulder of the oxen to perform work, right? And then we've got that concept of work over, to carefully and thoroughly perform a task such as a gleaning of the field, also to mock in abuse in the sense of walking over another, okay? A furnace used for metals because of the raising of the temperature. Again, this raising this up, this elevation, but also a yoke, okay? And then we've got Allah, which means the lifting of a yoke onto the shoulder. One taken into exile is placed in a yoke for transport. The yoke of bondage, it was a common practice to strip off the clothes of those taken into exile. And then we have Allah, which is what, to go up or to bring higher, which is our offering, the Olah offering, right? The offering that ascends or gives you the ascension. Then we've got Ul, which is yoke itself. Then we've got Ula in the sense of benefit, which is a raising of your economic status. Okay, and then we've got this ma'il, which is a cloak or garment worn over the other clothes, or over clothing instead of under clothing. And then we get to Baal. So what have we discovered so far? What have we discovered so far in this word Baal? That there is a connotation of a yoke, indicating a master or a driver of that yoke, and there is a connotation of authority in that, but also there is an elevation. So in the sense of the yoke being raised and put over the shoulders of the but by adding the bait into it, we have what? We have, by adding the bait into it, all of a sudden we have as a yoke which binds the master to the servant. So that's the sense of binding to a husband. So the key here, that Baal means husband. Why? Because of the bait. I'm going to show you. Okay, so what do we have so far that we've discovered? Our root word is actually all, and it means experience the yoke okay? Experience the yoke. But then by adding the bait in, it's experiencing the yoke of the tent. Experience the yoke of the tent, or husband. Okay? Now, here's something that's intriguing about this. This word represents not the equal part of a husband, because there's an equal part of a husband, but this is the authoritative part of the husband. Recall that the clan leader, or the head of the household, or the head of the tent, is actually a sovereign. What does that mean? What is sovereignty? Well, there's a few ways that we could go about this, but I think the simple one is to just go back and get the word sovereign out of the etymological dictionary. Okay? So taking a look at that, we've got sovereign, which is basically the superior ruler master, and this is late 13th century, and it's in when we're looking at it in the sense of it being an adjective, it's an actionable part of a noun process. But what I want you to see is this concept of a peasant and a tyrant. Okay, the meaning gold coin worth 22 whatevers, and so a sovereign was actually a coin, right? And the principle is that he who had the gold made the rules, but the principle was also that a sovereign was a monetary compensation that was sanctioned by the king. Okay, so that's where we get the idea of sovereign. But anyways, getting back into our word, superior or supreme, which is coming from the Italian soprano, right? Or the Latin super, which means to be over, or the Proto-Indo-European root uper, which means to be over, which of course we have in the modern European, whether it be the Scandinavian or the Germanic tribes, we have it as uber, right? Okay, so spelling influenced folk etymology association with reign. Okay, so it's the idea of reigning over someone, potent in a high degree, right? And so short version is that this is the highest known authority. Well, that's what the head of the household was. Now, I can show you how there's also a word that has to do with being equal to a woman in the household of a man and a woman. But this word Baal means husband. Now you might go, well, wait a minute. Baal is a god. Yes. And what's crazy is that literally that just meant husband. The Canaanites were attached to a god they called husband. But I want to show you where where Yahweh flat out calls himself Baal real quick, okay? So here's our word Baal we were looking at. And now I'm just going to go down to our prophets real quick. And we will, oh goodness, accidentally hit that update button. Took us on a journey. Gotta get back. Okay, here we go. Okay. Here we go. Jeremiah. My bad. We got to go to the noun, not the verb. So this is the verb, this is the noun, and this is the verb. You notice there's really no difference in the spelling. However, now we should be able to get to where I'm trying to go. Okay, we'll go a different route. Jeremiah chapter 31, 31 through 33. What is those verses? That is the new covenant, right? Behold, the day is coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. Okay, this covenant will not be like the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt. They broke that covenant, though I love them as a husband loves his wife, says the Lord. That's a really junky version. Let's do NASB on this. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 is where it starts. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. Okay, so now jumping into this. Now, there's some people who claim that the scribes changed this to Baal. However, I don't think that's necessarily the case. We have plenty of confirmations here to the contrary. Okay, whoops, not verse 31, verse 32. Okay, and this is very specifically where I want you to see, right there. Baalti, and boom, we're back to our word Baal, right? To merit, rule over, or possess, or own. Okay, now, before people start freaking out about the misogynistic nature of this concept of ownership or possession, I want you to think in terms of authority and not in terms of chattel slavery. Okay, I want you to think in terms of stewardship. Okay, that's how you want to look at this. Somebody who's an authority. Let's go back to our ancient Hebrew philosophy. Our ancient Hebrew philosophy is that concept or idea of if a person is strong enough to best another person in battle, then they are an authority over them. Now, obviously, you don't have to best a woman in battle in order to be an authority over her. But the principle is that he who is in authority over you now has to provide provision, protection, and instruction to you, right? And so the principle is the greater and the lesser, the idea that there is a greater or higher authority versus not. Now, there's two reasons why this is important, okay? The first reason is because, again, the false god, Baal, means husband, right? Or a master or owner. But watch how this works. Okay, now what we're going to do is combine these two words in a second here. So we just want to get back to our board for just a moment and take a look at what we've got going on. Well, first of all, obviously, we did not need any of that stuff, right? We didn't need to go trace it. However, we do need to talk about the concept of how this becomes experiencing the yoke, okay? It's literally the concept of taming or breaking, right? And so I want to look in terms of this right here, okay? Experience the yoke, which is the concept of taming. Because why? Because the principle could be lost in the word husband if we're talking about taming. And I'm sure there's a few women, even in the congregation, who would be like, yeah, not happening. It will not be tamed. But the principle or the idea is that what are you being tamed for? Okay. So let's talk a minute about ancient Hebrew agriculture when it comes to animal husbandry. One of the things that the Hebrews would practice is the principle of taking an experienced animal and placing it with inexperienced animals so that they automatically tame as a result of seeing the experienced older seniority type of a situation animal actually be obedient. And so the premise is that basically there would be a demonstration of obedience by the older animal. The younger animal would be placed in the corral with the older animal who is out of control and not tame yet, not broken yet. And then there is this concept that they would start to follow and practice. Because why? Because mammals are herd instinct animals, which means there's an alpha. There's always an alpha. There's always one who takes the lead and the other follows in a herd, okay? Whether that be as a result of an establishment of combat, like, for example, what happens with sheep when they butt heads, or whether it be when bulls lock horns, or when wolves fight each other. There's always an alpha. There's always an alpha male, and then that one will end up kind of leading the group. Now, it's less per se with cattle and with sheep than it would be with wolves, but the concept is the same. So when we talk about a yoke, there's something you need to know. In yoking in Hebrew times, what they would do is they would put an inexperienced ox with an experienced ox. And then that yoking would cause both oxes to go in the same direction, but only one of the oxes actually knows the line. The other ox is pulling against the yoke, trying to go in a different direction, but of course the goads are driving it a certain way. So experiencing the yoke is actually the entire concept of being driven down a certain path with an experienced, much older, wiser alpha, and then a younger, inexperienced beta. There's two reasons why this is important. The first one is because experiencing the yoke is learning to be obedient, or learning how to step into obedience. Okay. Now, because obviously sometimes you learn how to step into obedience from the sense that you are actually driven by the goads and you're pulling against the yoke, trying to get loose of it or trying to go the way you want to go, but the older, much wiser ox is going a certain direction and you cannot pull away. That's also one of the reasons why you can't put two different species together when it comes to beasts of burden, is because there will be two alphas, number one, and number two, there will be two different styles of work being done. Okay, and so that's where we get the concept of being unequally yoked, which is the idea of you putting the donkey with the ox. The donkey does not recognize the authority of the alpha ox. Only another ox would accept the authority of the alpha ox or the aleph, right? Okay, so there's the reason why this is important is because when we get back into this here, now you understand that taming is not in the sense of being some subservient bride, but in the sense of learning how to walk the path and accept the yoke and pull the burden, right? Pull the plow. When Yeshua says, my burden or my yoke is light, what he's saying is if you have burdens, come to me and I will give you rest, for my yoke and my burden is light. What he's saying is when you pull my plow, it is not going to be as strenuous and as overwhelming as it would be if it was someone else. So when we're talking about tame, the way I want you to think about it is when you're being tamed, you are learning how to walk the path as the alpha does. So that's our sense of authority here. Okay? This is the authoritative husband. This is the sovereignty of the husband, Baal. Okay? So now let's connect the two. Going back to our original screen here, we have this principle of splitting open, okay? Splitting open and exposing fruit. Splitting open and exposing fruit. And bearing witness of that, right? So splitting open, exposing fruit, and bearing witness of that fruit. Now, in this one, we have experienced the yoke or the authority of the husband, the authoritative husband, okay? And so in this sense, there's one other thing we need to look at. In fact, we're going to go back to this screen really quick, and we're going to add the Vav. So let's get rid of all this jive. Okay. And we're going to add the Vav here. Just going to move this over just a smidge. And then we're going to add the Vav. What did I just do? What is the Vav? Well, the Vav is the ancient Hebrew nomadic usage of Y-shaped stakes to secure the tent. Okay. And so all of this is to secure the opening that exposes the fruit. That's Peor. Now, jumping over here. Now we understand that that means to secure. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So now we have Baal, or the authoritative husband, who secures the exposing of fruit. Okay, we're going to talk about fruit here in a minute. But what I want you to see is that basically what this is saying, because if we have a tyrannical husband, then we have a master, right? A tyrannical husband would be a master. Master of fruit. Okay. Baal Peor means the master of fruit, or the master of exposing the fruit, right? Master of exposing fruit. In fact, let's go ahead and fix that really quick and say master of exposing Okay. Master of exposing fruit. So now we get to this concept of sin, right? And the word sin, chata, has in it the concept of separation. Okay. Chata is the idea of separation. So when we're dealing with chata, the concept or idea is that you're being separated away from something. Well, we don't really encounter the depth of this until we get into how it is labeled. Sin is always labeled in the sense of a violation of Torah. In fact, if we allow usually what I do is I reverse engineer the latter writings, or what Marcion called the New Testament. I reverse engineer it back to the prophets, and then from the prophets back to Torah, from Torah back to the ancient pictographic language to hear the story of the New Testament word. However, in this case, there is an opportunity for the New Testament to actually define this. And that's in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. Sin is a transgression of the law, or lawlessness, right? Lawlessness, or anomia in the Greek. Okay. But in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, it was the sense of a tent wall, which is separation. And it's this idea of separating from something. Well, it always has to do with Torah. Well, what is Torah in the sense of how we would understand it? Well, if we are going to go with a modern definition, we call it law, right? We call it this stringent demand for obedience with all of these wrathful consequences. Well, unfortunately, that's a very bad definition. And unfortunately, that lends itself to anti-Semitism, which was a sentiment that was present in the ancient church fathers because of the way in which the rabbis had begun to distance themselves and treat the Christians a certain way. And of course, the Christians were being persecuted by Rome. And so the Jews pulled away because they didn't want to be persecuted. And so people began to identify themselves as Gentiles, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being is that the ancient church fathers definitely had anti-Semitism in them and antinomianism in them, the teaching of the Nicolaitans, right? This idea that Torah has been done away with. Well, that's because Torah is presented in a negative light. However, we see that there's a definition that Torah is actually that which brings life. We see that in Deuteronomy when Moses says, "Behold, I set before you life and death, a blessing and a curse. Choose life that you might live." And he was presenting Torah to the people. But then, of course, Paul says, is that which was supposed to bring life, bring death? No, most certainly not. But sin within me brought death, right? Okay, so the principle is that death is not the order of operations when it comes to how Torah works. Torah is a ministry of life until it becomes a ministry of death. Well, what's intriguing about this is what it actually says in the Hebrew understanding of everlasting life. The Hebrew understanding of everlasting life is not living forever. The Hebrew understanding of everlasting life is a life that is ancient, an ancient life, as in long lived, okay? And so when we talk about everlasting life in that sense, which I'm not going to get too deep into that theology, but the principle is that basically there's an idea that you're going to grow old and that you're going to go down to the grave in shalom and not in war, and that you are going to not die in your sins, so to speak, okay? Why is this so important? Well, basically, short version of this is that what we have going on is this idea here of Baal Peor, meaning master of exposing fruit. Okay, master of exposing fruit. Well, there's a few reasons why this is important. The first reason is because they call it the sin of Peor, or the sin of Baal Peor. And all the places where it's used have to do with this one instance that occurs. So finally, like I said at the beginning, we were actually going to start here in Numbers chapter 25, and we're eventually going to get to our parasha. While Israel remained in Shittim, the people began to commit infidelity with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed to their gods. So Israel became followers of Baal Peor, and Yahweh was angry with Israel. And Yahweh said to Moshe, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before Yahweh, so that the fierce anger of Yahweh may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill his men who have become followers of Baal Peor. Then behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aharon, the priest, saw it, he rose up from the midst of the congregation and took a spear in his hand, and after the man of Israel went after the man of Israel into the inner room of the tent and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through the abdomen. So the plague of the sons of Israel was brought to a halt. But those who died in the plague were 24,000 in number. Now, this begins this week's parasha. Then Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aharon, the priest, has averted my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I'm giving him my covenant of shalom, and it shall be for him and for his descendants after him a covenant of permanent priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel. So we can see that the concept here of Baal Peor has this underlying study, right? This underlying meaning. These people join themselves to a fruit master, right? They join themselves to someone who would control their fruit. Now, there's two reasons why this is important. The first one is that Yeshua said you will know them by their fruits. The second is that Yeshua said a good tree cannot bear bad fruit and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Going into Galatians chapter 5, we can see that there is actually a reference to the fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no Torah. Okay? What does he mean by against such things there is no Torah? When you are manifesting these things, you are operating in something higher than the Torah. How do we know? Because these are the attributes of Yahweh. These are the attributes of Yahweh, and they're very similar to this list right here in Exodus chapter 34. He says, compassionate, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in faithfulness and truth, who keeps faithfulness for thousands, and who forgives wrongdoing, which is a violation of his law, and sin. Okay? Now, getting back into our verse in Galatians, we can see that Paul's repeating this here. So he's saying these are attributes of Yahweh, right? he's saying you need to show these things, right? The fruit of the Spirit. But one of the things I want you to see is that this is fruit of the Spirit. Okay? But then up here, we see the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are sexual immorality, impurity, indecent behavior, idolatry, witchcraft, hostilities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like of which I've forewarned you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Then he says, but the fruit of the Spirit. Okay? But before he says this, he says something very interesting. I'm sorry, not before he says this. After he says this, in Galatians 6, he says that each one must examine his own work, and he will have reason for boasting, but to himself alone, not to another. For each will bear his own load. Here's Paul making a yoke reference. The one who is taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches him. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a person sows, he will also reap. For one who sows to his own flesh will reap destruction from the flesh, but the one who sows to the Spirit will reap eternal life from the Spirit. Let's not become discouraged in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not become weary. All right, so let's talk a minute about this. In Deuteronomy 28, we have the blessings and the curses. The first 15 verses are blessings. The rest of the verses up to verse 68 are curses. None of those have anything to do with the expiration of the body, nor do they have anything to do with the continuance of the body. For example, when it says, you will be the head and not the tail, we are not talking about body parts. We are talking about the idiomatic process of the greater and the lesser, of being spiritually, financially, and politically elite. That's what Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14 promises you. Now, the reason why this is so important is because then when we start to look at this in terms of life and death, we're going to encounter this concept of fruit. How do I know? Because this is what it says. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a person sows, this he will also reap. Okay? And we know that the principle here is the idea of reciprocation, which is a foreign concept to our Western minds. In fact, the pulpit is afraid of it. It sounds too much like karma. Okay? But the premise is that when you do an action in the natural realm, when you do an action in the natural realm, that then has some sort of parallel process in the supernatural realm. Let's talk for a minute about the supernatural realm. One of the things that unfortunately we get into when it comes to Christianese is a concept that we are dealing with some sort of personality and some sort of entity that has form. You cannot think of the realm of action in terms of form. What do I mean by the realm of action? Let us make, in the Hebrew is the word asa, which means to action. It is the concept of what? It is the concept of there being a force moving in a certain direction. So it has what? It has an origin, it has a destination, and that path between the two is the direction that it's moving. But that also means that it's not governed by height, width, depth, time, right? It's not governed by those things. It's governed by hindrance and non-hindrance. In other words, there are other energies preventing the energy from moving in the direction it is supposed to go. So you do an action in the physical realm. So let's talk about this in terms of practicality. James chapter 1, starting verse 12, says we're led away of our own lusts, right? We're led away of our own lusts, and when lust is conceived, it becomes sin, and when sin is fully birthed, it becomes death. Now, what's intriguing about this is when we think about this in terms of temptation. So now I'm at a store that sells expensive watches. I see a watch up on the counter. The clerk is over doing nothing. There's no cameras in the store. It's an old mom and pop shop, whatever the reasons are. I know that I can take this watch. Now I have the temptation to take the watch because I coveted it, right? I saw it and began to desire and therefore began to want it and draw it to me. And so then after that, now I have to make a decision. I'm either going to steal the watch, right? Thou shalt not steal, or I'm going to leave it. If I steal the watch, I activate the judgment or the ministry of death. If I steal the watch, thou shalt not steal. Now, if it is during the daytime and I steal the watch and the person catches me, they're not allowed to kill me. But if it's during the nighttime and they can't tell who I am, they're allowed to kill me, which means what? Thou shalt not steal has the attachment of death to it. But when I steal the watch, I activate the judgment that I now have to be stolen from. Why? Because an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now I have to be stolen from. And of course, we're going to apply mercy to that judgment. But in the principle, I take the watch. Now I have the watch. Now I have activated judgment. There is an avenger now appointed to pursue me and to create a scenario in which I am stolen from. Now, if I am caught, I have to pay back 1/5 or 20% of what I stole, okay? So now I have to pay back the watch itself and 20%, which will come in the form of me becoming what? An indentured servant, or I can pay the debt. It's one of the two. But either way, I am now owned by the person whom I stole from until that debt is paid. Once that debt is paid, they no longer have ownership. Okay, so the principle or the concept is that as soon as I take the watch, I have activated a force in the other realm that is going to draw theft to me, okay? The principle is that there is a force in that realm, not a personality, a force, but that is a force of vengeance that is going to bring about a situation in which I get stolen from. Now we get into the concept of Yom Kippur and repentance and all that, which I've talked about before, where you have to go back and go through the temptation again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here is the part that is important. As we go through this process, what is going on is Torah now has activated a judgment upon me, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I have to be stolen from, right? If I'm caught and I have to pay the debt, then that is canceled. The supernatural realm no longer is going to bring about a scenario. But here's what I want you to think about. when I did that action and that force was activated in the supernatural realm, that was not the physical realm. But where is the change going to occur? Where is the reciprocation going to occur? In the natural realm. So no matter how spiritual it is, it has to come back through, it has to cut through that threshold back into the physical realm. So now we've got some dude sitting on the side of the road, doesn't have any money, and he stopped in front of my house because he ran out of gas and I'm not home, and there's a can of gas on my side by side. Where's that voice going to come from, right? And now he's going to steal my can of gas. So the point that I'm trying to make is this idea that there is a reaping of what you sow. You sow to the flesh, you'll reap corruption. You sow to the spirit, you'll reap everlasting life. But sowing to the spirit. So now I have the temptation to take the watch. I don't take the watch. I say, thou shalt not steal, self. And self goes, yes, sir, my bad. Because why? Because I have accepted the yoke of Torah. Now the supernatural realm has something happen in it. And the supernatural realm is going to activate what? A reward for that. According to what? Deuteronomy chapter 28, which would be what? Something to do with material items. Because I left that person's material item there, I probably now will get that material item, but that was activated in the supernatural. That was a force of energy that is now moving in a direction that's eventually going to cross the threshold back into height, width, depth, time, okay? And manifest itself here as a reward. Manifest itself here as maybe a watch, maybe 3 watches. Maybe I get a watch store, who knows? But the concept is that force is activated in the supernatural realm. So let's talk a minute about a sin unto death, okay? A sin unto death. Death in the physical realm does not manifest in a manner of lack and decrease, or in a manner of want. Death in the physical realm manifests in the manner of expiration of the body. That's how we understand death. And there is a clear function of the expiration of the body present in these narratives in the wilderness, or Bamidbar, in Numbers. Okay? So we sin a sin unto death now. We join ourselves to Baal Peor. Okay? We just join ourselves to Baal Peor, which is what? Is punishable by death. Where? Where? What is occurring when you have joined yourself to Baal Peor? You are going after another god, right? You are worshiping a false god. And so what has happened in the supernatural realm? The soul that sins shall die. But what is death for a soul? Why does it say the soul that sins shall die, when it is definitely the human who is sinning? So you commit an action in the natural realm. The supernatural realm now activates a death. That death in the supernatural realm equates to like kind attracting like kind. And so the way that this works is now the supernatural realm is going to send a reciprocation of that process. That process is what? That you have chosen to go after other gods. And so you are granted your wish, and another god receives mastery or husbandship over you. The supernatural realm has activated the death of the marriage between Yahweh and his people. How do we know? Because in Judges, who oppressed the Israelites? Midian. I will remind you, as we go back into our verse here, I will remind you in Numbers chapter 25 that it is a Midianite woman who is killed by Phinehas, and a Israelite man. And her father, Zur, is the head of the people of a father's household in Midian, a prince of Midian. And we have the Midianites oppressing Israel in Judges. So we see a continuation of the cycle of Israel, this idea of an infestation, an oppression, and then a possession. And that possession is that of another God. And according to Deuteronomy 32, verses 15 through 17, them are demons. Okay? All right. Now, who will always demand? The demons will always demand human sacrifice, exploitation of children, exploitation of women, cruelty to animals, and social injustice. Okay? All right. So why is this important? Well, getting back to fruit. Reaping what you sow has to go through a supernatural process. Okay? So in order to bear the fruit of the Spirit, remember, fruit is the result of sowing. And that's the part that people don't think about when they talk about the fruit of the Spirit. Fruit is the result of sowing. So the fruit of the Spirit would have to have been sown first. Got me? If you sow to the Spirit. So the principle is that you would have to have practiced it, and then the fruit of it would come back. And so what's intriguing is when Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is bup, 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 and we know them by their fruits, we're getting back into Deuteronomy 28, where blessed is your kneading bowl, or blessed is your basket, which what proves what? What's the blessing? Let's go back to that philosophical concept. The sun shines on the just and the unjust. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. There's already an opportunity for you to plant because of the rainbow, which guarantees seed time and harvest, heat and cold, and therefore we have our seasons, and the rainbow guarantees that you will have a season of sowing and you will have a season of reaping. And if you plant during the season of sowing, you will most likely reap. So what makes something a blessing? What makes something abundance? It has to be more. It has to be bigger. It has to be supernatural. It has to be miraculous. And if that's the case, and a blessing has to be supernatural and miraculous and bigger, then just me getting a watch after I coveted a watch and decided not to steal it, it's not a blessing. Some dude can walk in and buy a watch. But when 3 watches come my way and they're free and I never had to pay for them, now I'm serving some other god than Baal. But now watch the danger of Baal Peor, master of the exposing of the fruit. Why was it dangerous to be joined to Baal Peor? He's the master of exposing the fruit. That's a good idea, right? We'll know them by their fruits. We will see the truth of who they are. Bad tree can't bear good fruit. Good tree can't bear bad fruit. Bad tree bears bad fruit. Bad fruit is exposed through what? The idea of what? A violation of Torah, right? So the principle is that bad fruit is exposed through the concept of taking the ministry of life and converting it into the ministry of death, in which now there is a judgment actioned upon you as a result of the commandment in Torah. Coming full circle, then, what we have is this idea that Baal of Peor was designed to expose the truth of the heart. And so from that, then, remember, Peor is a foreign word. but the Hebrews chose to spell Peor that way, right? And so as a result of that, we can go back to our root and we can look at this thing of exposing the fruit. The reason why this is so important is because Yahweh considered that a sin for them to be joined to another God, but this is a very specific kind of God who exposes fruits, right? Who's a master of exposing fruits. So why would it be a sin to have your fruit exposed? Well, you need to think again, you were led away of your own lust. They already wanted to worship other gods. And Moses even says this in Deuteronomy. He says, I know the moment I'm gone, you guys are going to go worship other gods. The moment you guys take the land, you're going to worship other gods. And you're not going to cast the gods out that I told you to cast out. I know you're not going to do what I told you to do. So when that happens and you fall into oppression, now you'll know why. He's communicating that. So why is this so important? Well, there's this process or concept that the expiration of the body of these humans in the sin of Baal Peor, in which 24,000 people die, is totally tied into what they sowed to begin with. Well, what they sowed to begin with was the result of the abundance of the heart. And so Baal of Peor exposes their fruit. Is it the fruit of the Spirit? No. So what people don't realize is when it says the fruit of the Spirit, it's the reward for what you sowed. Love, joy, peace, loving kindness, all that is not you manifesting that. It's you being rewarded with that. And it has to be a blessing, not the sun shining on the just and the unjust. In other words, it has to be ridiculous. Ridiculous loving kindness, ridiculous patience, shown to whom? You. Which would have required you to have sown that in the first place. Which means what? That we action these things to begin with. So when we're talking about the expiration of the body, we need to trace death back to the spiritual. And then we need to trace the spiritual back to Torah, which sin, violating Torah, sin, a transgression of the law, violating Torah, activates a reciprocation in the supernatural realm that then manifests as death in the physical realm, which means what? You're going to die early. Everlasting life or ancient living or becoming ancient is not the concept of going to heaven. That's a very different situation. That's the world to come. That's a very different concept. Okay? Just like Sheol is a very different concept. Gehenna is a very different concept. But the principle of everlasting life is in the function or concept of growing old. Honor your mother and father that your days may be long in the land. There was an understanding that legacy plays a role here. And it makes sense because the sins of the fathers are visited on the sons to the third and fourth generation. So what is the point of needing to understand the depth of the sin of Baal Peor? The depth of the sin of Baal Peor is that fruit still needed to be exposed in Israel. Because what's the next thing that happens in this parasha? The next thing that happens in this parasha is a new census. Now, we understand in our understanding in this congregation that we are not dealing with a counting of the people in the sense of writing down a person's name and logging how many people are there, but instead that these are all who bear witness to life, bear witness to Yahweh. I was having a discussion with someone earlier this week, and one of the things that we were talking about was the ability to keep or not keep Torah. There is a sentiment in Christianity. There's an understanding in Christianity that you can't keep Torah. And yet that's not scriptural. That's not what Moses says. That's not what Paul says, etc., etc. However, altogether, if you count the 24,000 people who died in the sin of Baal Peor, you count the 14,500 people died in the sin of the rebellion of Korah. You count the 3,000 people who died in the sin of the golden calf. And you count the people who died who tried to go into the promised land if they were told not to. And let's say that we factor in maybe a couple more instances in which people died, like, for example, the quail, then we're probably in the realm of about 100,000 people. Now, when Israel left Egypt, they were 600,000 some men on foot, military age. Factor in the women and children, and we have around 1 million people leaving Egypt. Around 600,000 people are counted in this census in Numbers chapter 26. But here's the intriguing part. That still equates to about 1 million people. Meaning what? 1% of the Israelites who left Egypt actually died in plagues or in judgments. The rest died of old age. The ones who came out of Egypt, and he said he was angry with that generation, et cetera, et cetera. What's my point? My point is this census that's taken in Numbers chapter 26 is actually a census of those who were obedient. Okay? So short version of this is that they all kept Torah. Now, the congregation or the assembly of Israel at large did not circumcise their children, did not keep Passover until they arrived at the promised land and crossed the Jordan, right? We know that. We know it was Passover, and we know they circumcised their children, and there was no practice of that in the wilderness. So they weren't exactly in order, but they were obedient enough that they did not die in the sins of these rebellions and this idolatry. Meaning what? Baal Peor exposed the bad fruit. Yahweh eradicated it, and now we have a people ready to go into the promised land. My proof, obviously, and of course, those who were at the Midrash last night, remember this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, reading out of the NASB, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39 says, "Moreover, your little ones whom you said would become a plunder, and your sons who this day have no knowledge of good and evil shall enter there and will give it to them, and they shall take possession of it." I'm not going to go into the depth of what is said here, but when it says no knowledge of good and evil, they have not eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil like Adam did. In other words, they had not yet walked in sin. And who's going in? Who's the ones that are accountable to that? The witnesses, as it were. How old were they? 20 years old and upward. Another fake sneeze. Okay. So the principle is that basically what I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to communicate here, Baal Peor exposed the hearts. Now there is a people ready to receive the promised land who don't know good and evil. Don't ask me how that's possible, but we have a sinless generation going into the promised land, and yet the church teaches that it's impossible to keep it. this is very important when it comes to Christian theology that says that Christ was sinless and that no one else can be sinless. And it's scary because if you read 1 John in this context, we're kind of out of order. We're kind of out of order. So, amen. What do we need to understand here? There is an oppressive master who can control your fruit. What's fruit? The reward. Okay? If the reward is present, if you see favor on a person, you know that they are walking with Yahweh. If the reward is present and you see prosperity on a person, you know that they're walking with Yahweh. Now, some people say, oh, wait a minute, what about the rich people in New York who are filthy rich? Well, number one, it says that the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. And number two, in Psalm chapter 37, it says they won't prosper. They will not always have that wealth. Maybe a couple generations before they lose it, but you see my point. We are a people who don't even believe in Torah. We are a people who don't even walk in Torah. We are a people who don't even believe in God. Not only have we arrived at a point where we have taken Torah and twisted it so thoroughly that now Christ has removed it, and therefore you can be practicing the things that the Israelites practiced that got them killed and get away with it. But we are stepping more and more and more into a state of death day by day as a nation. You know what's crazy? You have the Israelites at the time of Yeshua's birth and life and Paul's, let's say from Yeshua's birth all the way to Paul's death. Okay. That's a long span of time, but we'll say basically, let's say that it was about 80 years, okay? Maybe less. In those 80 years, the people of Israel never deviated from believing in God. There were no atheists. The people of Israel did not practice intentional sin without major consequence. Look at how many times they tried to stone Yeshua, or tried to stone a prostitute, or tried to condemn somebody to death or to chastisement during Paul's time. They believed in God. They just had bad doctrine. They believed in God. Oh, here's another one. All of them practiced Torah. Life's issues, the transforming and the renewing of the mind, the esteeming of days, the definition of food, all of those things were Torah based. That was the foundation. That was the belief. We are so far from that culture, so far from those obediences, so far from those actions that we no longer have the supernatural realm reciprocating to us in the powerful way that it was in the book of Acts. You want to see the book of Acts again? First thing that we need to do is turn our hearts back to the Father and begin to become obedient to his commandments. Stop splitting hairs about whether you sacrifice or not. Stop splitting hairs about whether or not this is the corner of your beard or that's the corner of your beard, or whether you can get a tattoo or not because it's not for the dead, and start keeping Torah. Second, after that, once we become a people who actually keep Torah, then we can start to get into the doctrines that are involved in Torah, not the doctrines that are outside of Torah. We can start looking at halakha. We can start looking at whether this is the corner of your beard or that's the corner of your beard. Okay? But we need to get back to Torah first. We need to return to what David loved. And we need to hate what David hated. And in the process of everything, we need to understand that there's a reason why those are communicated that way. In other words, there is a sentiment in Scripture, not in the Bible, in Scripture. Scripture is the Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, or what Marcion called the Old Testament. That's scripture. Okay. The latter writings is the Bible, right? The compendium of all those books together and maybe some that are missing. But what's the point? And what's the importance here? Return to Torah. Once we've returned to Torah and we have like-mindedness, we can start looking at echadness, and we can start looking at manifestations of energy that causes us to be more than just people living a life, having an expiration date. When we talk about sin being exposed, we don't think in terms of the fruit that we see. Now, we have to be careful because Yeshua did have that encounter where the disciples came to him and said, hey, who has sinned? This guy's mom or his dad? Because he was born blind. Obviously, the curse was on him from birth. That is not scriptural. That was bad doctrine, and Yeshua understood that. So don't get caught up in it. I am not talking about the concept that your child is born blind or disabled. I am talking about the concept that there is a sin, temptation visited upon your children as a result of your behavior. That is not part of this process of fruit exposure. But what I want you to see is that there's a master behind this exposing of the fruit. And therefore, there's almost a bondage to a specific kind of fruit. And that's the key to this thing. And that's why when Yahweh says it's the sin of the Al-Peor, the sin of the master of the exposing fruit, is that they joined themselves to the fruit exposure. Meaning he could control the fruit, which makes sense. And when Paul says we are no longer slaves of sin, but slaves of righteousness, therefore we are no longer obligated to sin. Okay, so to sum it up, you do an action in this realm, there is an action activated in the supernatural realm, then reciprocates back into this realm and appears as fruit or a reward for your actions, good or evil. That then will tell other people who you are. So it is not the action itself that shows the fruit. It's the reward later on that shows the fruit. Okay? All right. I'm sure there's a really good midrash coming, so we're going to go ahead and get to it. For those of you who are on YouTube, I will go ahead and say Shabbat Shalom to you. We're going to end the live stream and have our midrash. And then for those of you who are going to be leaving, I will also say Shabbat Shalom. So our YouTubers and also our people who won't be staying for the midrash, I will say Shabbat Shalom to you and have a good rest.